The signing of the peace treaty at Versailles signaled the official end of World War I, optimistically called the war to end all wars. But even during World War I, President Woodrow Wilson had feared the war was more about power and territory than peace.
Is the present war a struggle for a just and secure peace, or only for a new balance of powers?
One of the goals of the treaty was to break up the four empires of Europe. 9 countries were given new boundaries and independence. As a result of the remapping, Germany lost territory to its surrounding countries. The treaty demanded Germany accept full blame for World War I and pay huge sums of money called reparations to the victorious nations. Germany was also stripped of much of its military power and forced to demilitarize the area near the border of France, known as the Rhineland. The intention of the Treaty of Versailles was largely to punish Germany for World War I, but also to create new democracies and self-determination in Europe. But huge war debts, hunger, and unemployment made it difficult for some democracies to flourish. In the end, the treaty that was meant to secure a lasting peace for Europe had, in effect, laid the groundwork for war. In Russian, Stalin means man of steel. The Soviet Union's communist leader Joseph Stalin certainly lived up to his name. During his rule, the Soviet Union achieved unprecedented power, but at the cost of freedom for its people. He launched a brutal transformation of Soviet agriculture through collectivization, forcibly taking over privately owned land, creating a system of state-owned farms. He also took control of manufacturing and production, creating huge government-controlled industries. Stalin created a police state in which anyone who disagreed with the government's policies could be arrested and sent to labor camps in Siberia. In 1930, Stalin began the Big Purge. So-called enemies of the people were arrested and executed. Historians estimate between 8 to 13 million people were killed. By 1939, Stalin had firmly established a totalitarian communist government with complete control over its citizens. All opposition was crushed. In Italy, similar events unfolded shortly after World War I. In 1919, dictator Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, or the Chief as he was called, began his rise to power. Mussolini became popular because he promised Italians he would rebuild Italy and create a new Roman Empire. Mussolini created a political movement called fascism, and in 1921 he became a member of the Italian parliament. In 1922, he and thousands of his fascist supporters, known as the Black Shirts, marched into Rome, demanding the Italian king give him power to lead the government. Not wanting to start a civil war, the king conceded. Mussolini was sworn in as prime minister in October. Like Stalin, Mussolini crushed any and all opposition to his totalitarian regime. At the end of World War I, Adolf Hitler was just another jobless soldier wandering around Germany. In 1919, he joined a small political party called the National Socialist German Worker, the Nazi Party. Like communists in the Soviet Union and fascists in Italy, the Nazis practiced an extreme form of nationalism, believing that the interests of their country were more important than any others, even more important than personal rights and freedoms. Hitler quickly rose to power to become the Nazi Party's leader, or Führer. In his 2-volume book Mein Kampf, My Struggle in English, Hitler spelled out his Nazi beliefs. He sought to unite all German-speaking people into a national state. He also maintained that the German or Aryan race was superior to all others. Hitler thought his master race deserved more land, even if it meant taking it by force. The economic hardships in Germany in the early 1930s helped Hitler and the Nazi Party gain power. In 1932, roughly 6 million Germans were jobless, and Hitler's promise to restore German pride and stature in the world appealed to them. As head of the Nazi Party, Hitler was appointed German Chancellor in January 1933. He quickly put an end to the faltering Weimar democracy and established his Third Reich, a totalitarian regime with himself as dictator. Hitler capitalized on hate and racism, blaming Jews for the economic problems plaguing Germany. Jews were ousted from government positions and certain professions, and barred from the use of public facilities. They were isolated and forced to wear a yellow Star of David. The discrimination escalated in November of 1938. Rampaging mobs attacked Jews in the street, in their homes, and at their places of work and worship. Nearly 100 Jews were killed, more than 1,000 synagogues burned, and over 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. This came to be called Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. Jewish property was seized, and Jews, Gypsies, and other groups considered unfit for Hitler's master race were sent to concentration camps. Over the course of the war, 6 million Jews and 5 million others were murdered by the Nazis. This became known as the Holocaust. The extent of the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps would not be fully realized until the war ended in 1945. Though the young Emperor Hirohito led Japan, the true power during the 1930s was in the hands of the Japanese military. The country was gripped in a frenzy of nationalism, and, like Germany and Italy, desired more land and resources for its growing population. In a surprise attack, September 1931, Japan invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria. Japan saw Manchuria as the first step in its desire for domination of China. The League of Nations, established to help keep peace after World War I, condemned Japan's invasion, but did nothing to stop it. In turn, Japan simply quit the League. By 1936, the clouds of war encircled the globe. Germany and Italy formed an alliance they described as an axis around which Europe would revolve. 4 years later, Japan would join the Axis powers, and together, the three countries pledged to aid each other in the event of attack. The extreme political philosophies that emerged during these troubled times appealed to many people worn down by economic hardship. But the overly patriotic beliefs of nationalism, the acceptance of totalitarianism, the militant and racist fascist beliefs of the Nazis, and the communist doctrines of state-controlled property and government all contributed to a worldwide war. In 1935, Benito Mussolini sought to distract the Italian people from their troubles at home by creating a war abroad. Claiming Ethiopia as their territory, the Italian military invaded the African country, easily defeating the poorly equipped nation. The following year, civil war erupted in the democracy of Spain between forces loyal to the government and those supporting fascist dictator Francisco Franco. The United States and the Soviet Union supported the loyalists, while Germany and Italy aided the fascists. These alliances were a preview of the coalitions that would form during World War II. Meanwhile, in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, Adolf Hitler began to rebuild the German military. He remilitarized the Rhineland with a series of defenses along the border of France. The League of Nations did nothing to respond to Hitler's enormous buildup of military might. Emboldened, on March 12, 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, marching over the border and occupying the country with a full-scale invasion. He then demanded Czechoslovakia surrender control of the Sudetenland. Once part of Germany, the Sudetenland was remapped as a territory in Czechoslovakia after World War I. Hitler believed it was the right of the Germans to take this land back. Britain and France had to respond to Hitler's aggression, but they faced a difficult decision. Rather than risk another war with Germany, they signed the Munich Agreement, forcing Czechoslovakia to relinquish the Sudetenland to the Germans. In return, Hitler promised that this would be his last territorial demand. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, felt appeasement of Hitler was a victory and received a hero's welcome when he arrived home.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Not all Englishmen agreed that appeasement was a victory. Winston Churchill, Chamberlain's eloquent political rival and later Prime Minister, chastised Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister. The policy of appeasement failed. Germany soon took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. In August of 1939, the Nazis and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact, vowing they would never attack each other. The pact between these two powers shocked the rest of the world. Stalin, though he hated the Nazis, signed to avoid war. But the non-aggression pact also contained a secret agreement, which allowed the Soviet Union territorial control of the eastern half of Poland and the Baltic states in the event of a war. Later, Stalin would learn a bitter lesson. Treaty or not, Hitler could not be trusted. Despite the troubling hostilities across the Atlantic, most Americans remained staunchly against involvement in any overseas struggles. Since the 1920s, America had steered a course of isolationism, staying out of foreign affairs. The Great Depression and the economic, social, and political turmoil it caused domestically contributed to the belief that Americans should concentrate on solving America's problems. In 1928, the U.S. signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact and were eventually joined by 61 other nations in a pledge to never make war again. By 1930, rumors spread claiming that bankers and munitions dealers, anxious to turn a quick profit, had dragged the United States into World War I. Congressional hearings ensued. They found that huge amounts of money had in fact been made by these so-called merchants of death. The American public's outrage only added to the anti-war sentiment. Clearly, Americans had no taste for another war.
In the event of war in Europe, I think we should stay out of it entirely. All our efforts should be made to keep out of the fight.
Let Europe fight their own battles. They mean nothing to us.
This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was well aware of the country's feelings. In 1935, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts, stopping the sale of arms or loans of money to nations at war. But by 1937, Roosevelt found it increasingly difficult to support isolationism. When Japan again invaded China in July of 1937, FDR ignored the Neutrality Acts, sending arms to aid China. Flooded with protests accusing him of leading America into war, FDR backed off, while tensions mounted in Europe and Asia.
I have been compelled to contrast our peace with very different scenes that are being enacted in other parts of the world.
In contrast to the turbulent events occurring overseas, America was at peace. The country was climbing out of the Great Depression, and people were beginning to again enjoy the fruits of a prosperous society. On September the 1st, 1939, Hitler ordered his troops into Poland. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, dropped a torrent of bombs on Poland's cities, while German tanks rolled across the countryside. It was the first use of the German military strategy called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, a new and devastating offensive that exploited new advances in tanks, artillery, and air power. Two days later, both Britain and France declared war on Germany. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland. World War II had begun. Despite the declarations of war, the next few months saw only an ominous calm settle over the Maginot Line, a labyrinth of defense fortifications along the eastern border of France. French, British, and German troops waited for something to happen. Many began to call this the phony war. As the months passed, however, the Nazis were planning their next acts of aggression. Beginning in April of 1940, the Nazis began their conquest of Western Europe. In a massive demonstration of Blitzkrieg, they invaded Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. The Germans ultimately set their sights on the conquest of France. French, British, and Belgian troops were stationed along the entire border of France, including the Maginot Line, though they left one area vulnerable, the Ardennes Forest. The French military believed that the heavily wooded area would be impenetrable to German forces. They were wrong. Hitler sent his tanks smashing through the Ardennes Forest into France, effectively cutting off opposition forces. British and French troops were overwhelmed by the German military offensive into France and retreated to the French coastal town of Dunkirk. Pinned to the sea, hundreds of thousands of troops were trapped. Surrounded by the Nazis, the soldiers seemed doomed. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill appealed for help. Soon, British Navy and civilian boats of all sizes and shapes emerged to form a makeshift flotilla. In less than a week, fishermen, grocers, tugboat captains, anyone with a seaworthy vessel ferried roughly 340,000 troops to safety across the English Channel. Their heroics saved the soldiers, but they couldn't save Paris. On June 21, 1940, the French capital fell to the Nazis. Hitler dictated his terms of surrender to the French government. Germany had succeeded in conquering Western Europe. Only Great Britain remained. The British people, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, were defiant.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing ground, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender.
Undeterred by Churchill's rhetoric, Hitler pressed on. In the Battle of Britain, the German Luftwaffe was ordered to bomb England. Between June and September of 1940, German planes pounded British targets. On just one evening alone in mid-August, over 1,000 Luftwaffe bombers invaded the skies over England. Germany soon began concentrating her air fury on the city of London. Londoners found refuge from the Blitz in air raid shelters and underground train stations. Frightened parents sent children out of the city to friends and relatives in the countryside. The attacks were relentless, but despite the overwhelming number of German planes, Great Britain's Royal Air Force, the RAF, fought back courageously. Using newly developed radar technology, the British were able to detect Luftwaffe planes coming over the English Channel. Early warning stations were set up along the English coast to detect the enemy and pinpoint German planes in the sky. On September 15, 1940, the RAF shot down the most German planes in a single day of battle. Defeated, Hitler called off his invasion for the time being. Addressing the British people, Winston Churchill gave thanks.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
But bravery alone could not win the war. Britain was crippled, with no more resources to build the planes and ships needed to withstand Germany's next attacks. Winston Churchill turned to America and FDR for help. In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt was re-elected to a third term as president, the only American president ever to serve more than 2 terms. Roosevelt would not commit troops to the overseas battlefield, but he vowed to help the British in their life-or-death struggle against Hitler's regime.
I ask this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations. Our most useful and immediate role is to act as an arsenal for them as well as for ourselves.
With FDR's urging, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Plan, which allowed him to lend or lease arms and other supplies to any country whose defense was vital to the United States. Not all Americans were united in their support of the president, however. Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1927, was a staunch opponent of America's involvement in the war.
We cannot allow the natural passions and prejudices of other peoples to lead our country to destruction.
Despite opposition from Lindbergh and others, the Lend-Lease Act was funded with $7 billion. By the time World War II was over, the bill would total $50 billion. 2 years after making a non-aggression pact with Stalin, Adolf Hitler turned his hostilities towards the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1941, he boldly ordered 3 million German soldiers to invade Russia. Stalin was outraged by Hitler's betrayal, and Russia joined in the fight against Hitler, becoming an ally of the West, if only for the duration of the war. Hitler hadn't counted on the harshness of the Russian terrain and the bravery of the Russian soldiers. Military resistance and brutal winter weather took a toll on the Germans, and their invasion ground to a weary halt. America now sent Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union as well as to Great Britain. But for American aid to help either nation, shipping lines across the Atlantic Ocean had to remain open. Hitler's submarines prowled the Atlantic in wolf packs, torpedoing supply ships. FDR ordered the Navy to protect all Lend-Lease shipments and allowed American warships to attack German submarines in self-defense. In July 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill finally met face-to-face in Argenta Bay, off Newfoundland. They agreed to issue a joint declaration on the goals of the war. Their agreement, the Atlantic Charter, became the basis for a new document called a Declaration by the United Nations, spelling out the ground rules for countries opposing the Axis powers. 26 countries eventually signed on and became known collectively as the Allied Powers. In the same month that Churchill and Roosevelt were meeting in the Atlantic, the Japanese were escalating their aggressions in the Pacific. Japan seized French Indochina, causing President Roosevelt to declare an embargo on goods being sent to Japan, including oil. Japan badly needed oil to defend herself from enemies or to wage war. Relations with Japan became even more strained. The United States demanded Japan leave the Axis powers and withdraw from China and Indochina. Japan's military leaders assured Emperor Hirohito they would make one more attempt to avoid war with the United States. But as Japan's peace envoy flew to Washington, D.C. for talks on November 5, 1941, the Japanese military prepared for an attack on America. 1 month later, on December 6th, FDR was shown an intercepted message sent to the Japanese negotiators, telling them to reject all American peace proposals. It was obvious. War with Japan was inevitable. December 7th dawned bright and sunny over the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. But shortly before 8 a.m., terror struck from the sky. Launching a surprise attack, over 300 Japanese warplanes bombed and torpedoed the base at Pearl Harbor. 200 aircraft were destroyed and 20 ships sunk or damaged. By the time it was over, 2,400 Americans were dead, over 1,100 wounded, and the entire Pacific Fleet crippled.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves.
The raid on Pearl Harbor caused more damage to the U.S. Navy in personnel and equipment than all the losses suffered during the entire First World War. 3 days later, Germany and Italy supported Japan by declaring war on the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked and enraged the American people. The time for isolation was clearly over. Now it was time for unity. Now it was time to fight. America's massive investment in ships, tanks, and the materials of war would bring an end to the Great Depression. It would also help unify a people through patriotism and sacrifice. The story of America's involvement in World War II continues in Part 2, The World at War.